This COVID-19 thing has hurt a lot of loggers in the United States and also in North Carolina.
At its peak, millions of people tuned in every single week. They loved the mud. They loved the machines. They loved Bobby Goodson. Then one day the show was just gone, with no warning, nor a finale episode. Most fans figured Bobby simply walked away. Maybe he got tired of the camera and moved on with life. But here is the thing nobody talks about. The real story didn't end when the show did. It was only just beginning. What really happened to Bobby Goodson after the cameras left? And why did one of reality TV's most beloved shows vanish without a single explanation? The reality behind reality TV. Swamp Loggers felt different from other reality shows. There were no staged arguments, no fake drama, no ridiculous twists cooked up by producers. What you saw was real people doing real work in one of the hardest environments imaginable. But here is what the cameras never showed you. The financial reality of running a logging operation was brutal, and every single day, Bobby Goodson was managing costs that most people would never dream of. Fuel, labor, insurance, equipment maintenance, it never stopped, and the bills kept coming, whether the logs were moving or not. Discovery Channel gave Bobby something genuinely valuable, and that something was exposure. Millions of viewers watched his crew work, and that kind of visibility is something most small business owners could only dream about. For a while it helped. New people learned his name, and his reputation grew beyond North Carolina. But exposure is not the same as stability. The show never paid Bobby's equipment bills. It never covered a broken hydraulic line on a skidder, and it never stepped in when a job site flooded and cost him 2 weeks of work. The cameras captured the drama of the swamp, but they quietly skipped over the part where Bobby sat down at night and tried to make the numbers work. That was the hidden story running underneath every single episode. Bobby was not just a logger on television, he was a business owner walking a financial tightrope every single week, while the world watched and cheered without ever realizing how close to the edge things really were. The show made the swamp look like the biggest challenge Bobby faced. But the swamp was never really the problem. The real problem had engines, price tags, and repair bills that never stopped growing. The business that was always on the edge. Here is something most Swamp Loggers fans never stopped to think about while watching the show. Every single piece of equipment Bobby Goodson used was extraordinarily expensive, and not regular expensive either, swamp expensive. Logging in wetland terrain requires specialized machines that most equipment dealers don't even stock. Things like swamp buggies, tracked skidders, and hydraulic processors built to survive mud, water, and brutal punishment every single day. Buying that equipment in the first place costs a fortune, and keeping it running costs even more. These machines don't break down gently. They break down hard and fast in swamp conditions. A hydraulic seal fails on a wet Tuesday morning, and suddenly your most important piece of equipment is sitting completely idle. You're not cutting, you're not hauling, you're not earning a single dollar. But the repair bill is already climbing higher and higher. Bobby's crew faced this reality constantly, and one breakdown didn't just mean a bad day. It meant days, sometimes weeks, of lost production. And in a business with already tight margins, that kind of loss can erase an entire month of profit in a single afternoon. The timber industry doesn't pause because your skidder needs a new track assembly. Contracts still have deadlines, mills still expect deliveries, and crews still expect their paychecks at the end of the week. Bobby carried all of that every single week with a smile on camera and a serious problem to solve the moment the cameras switched off. What made his operation truly impressive wasn't just the logging itself. It was the fact that he kept the entire business running through conditions that would have broken most people long before the swamp ever got the chance. But when the show ended, the expenses didn't, and without the spotlight, everything got harder, a lot faster. When the cameras left and the pressure stayed, when Swamp Loggers ended in 2012, something important changed for Bobby Goodson, but it wasn't the work. The work stayed exactly the same. The mud was still there. The machines still needed fuel. The crews still needed paying. And the timber still needed cutting and hauling to the mill every single week without exception. What changed was the visibility. During the show's run, Bobby's name carried extra weight, and people across the country knew exactly who he was. That kind of recognition quietly opens doors in business in ways that are hard to measure but very easy to feel. Contractors talk to other contractors, mills talk to other mills, and when your name is attached to a popular television show that millions of people watched every week, people pick up the phone a little faster and trust you a little quicker without you even having to ask. After 2012, that advantage slowly faded away, and it faded quietly, without any single dramatic moment to point to. Bobby went back to competing the way independent loggers always have, purely on reputation and relationships built over many years of showing up and doing the work properly. That is not a weak position to be in, because Bobby had earned genuine respect in his industry long before any camera crew ever arrived in North Carolina, and that respect didn't disappear when the show did. But the industry itself was beginning to shift in ways that nobody on his crew could fully control or predict. Timber mills were quietly consolidating across the region. Larger corporate operations were absorbing smaller ones, and the entire structure of how timber got sourced and delivered was slowly changing underneath everyone's feet. The kind of specialized, independent logging work that Bobby's company had built its entire reputation on was becoming harder to find, harder to price competitively, and harder to sustain as a standalone business model. Bobby kept working through all of it. He didn't disappear, and he absolutely didn't quit. But the pressure that had always been present was now building without any safety net underneath him. The cameras had gone, the spotlight had moved on completely, and the bills were still arriving every single morning without fail. But losing the spotlight was only part of the problem, because the industry Bobby had given his life to was quietly turning against people exactly like him. The industry that turned against him. Bobby Goodson didn't lose his business because he made poor decisions, and he didn't lose it because he stopped working hard or stopped caring about the quality of what his crew produced. He lost it because the world around him started changing in ways that no individual person, no matter how tough or experienced or dedicated, could fight against alone. The timber industry was transforming quietly, and most people watching from the outside never noticed a single thing. Large corporations were buying up smaller timber mills across the Southeast at a steady pace, consolidating operations, cutting costs wherever possible, and fundamentally changing the way they sourced their wood. Where they once relied on independent logging crews like Bobby's to bring timber in from difficult terrain, they were increasingly turning to larger contracted operations that could offer much bigger volume at much lower prices. And the math made the decision easy for them, even if the human cost was significant. That shift squeezed people like Bobby from both sides at the same time. On one side, the available work was shrinking steadily, and contracts that used to be relatively straightforward were now being competed for by bigger outfits with more equipment, more staff, and lower overhead costs that a small independent operator simply couldn't match, no matter how efficiently he ran things. On the other side, the prices mills were willing to pay for timber weren't keeping pace with the rising costs of actually getting that timber out of the ground and delivered on time. Specialized swamp logging, the exact skill that Bobby had spent his entire career mastering and building a reputation around, was becoming less valued in a market that was increasingly chasing volume and speed over craftsmanship and reliability. It wasn't personal, it was just business. But that almost made it harder to accept. Because Bobby couldn't argue with a corporate consolidation strategy, he couldn't outbid a company 10 times his size, and he couldn't change the direction an entire industry had decided to move in. All he could do was keep showing up every single day and hope the margins held long enough for something to shift. But behind the scenes, the weight of everything was stacking up, and the silent years that followed would reveal just how much Bobby was quietly carrying alone. The silent years nobody talked about. After the show ended, Bobby Goodson didn't vanish, and he didn't walk away from everything he had built. He just kept working, quietly and without fanfare, the same way he had always done long before any camera crew ever showed up in North Carolina. The years between 2012 and the late 2010s were what you might call the silent years. There were no headlines, no viral moments, no dramatic updates for fans to follow. Bobby would occasionally post on social media, a photo here, a short update there, nothing dramatic and nothing that hinted at the scale of what was building beneath the surface. To anyone casually checking in, it looked like life was simply carrying on, and in some ways it was. Bobby was still logging, still managing his crew, still getting up before sunrise to tackle work that most people couldn't last a single day doing. The dedication never wavered, and the work ethic that made him a fan favorite on television was just as present off camera as it ever was on it. But the numbers were telling a different story. Costs were rising steadily year after year, fuel prices crept upward, equipment maintenance bills grew larger as the machines aged, and the revenue coming in wasn't growing at the same pace. The margins that had always been tight were getting tighter, and the window for things to turn around was slowly getting smaller. Bobby never made a public fuss about any of it, because that simply wasn't who he was. He was the kind of man who handled his problems quietly and kept showing up regardless. But quietly handling a problem and actually solving it are two very different things. By the late 2010s, the math had stopped being something Bobby could quietly manage, and it was about to demand his full attention. When the math stopped working, there is a moment in every struggling business when the numbers stop being a problem you can work around, and they become a wall you simply cannot climb over. And for Bobby Goodson, that moment had been quietly approaching for years. By the late 2010s, every single pressure point in his operation was pushing against him at the same time. The equipment that had carried his crew through years of brutal swamp work was aging, and aging equipment in that environment doesn't just slow down gracefully, it fails, expensively, and without much warning. The choice Bobby faced wasn't simple: replace the machines and take on serious debt, or keep repairing them and watch the maintenance costs eat whatever profit was left. Neither option was a good one. Diesel prices were rising steadily during this period, and for a logging operation that runs heavy machinery across difficult terrain every single day, fuel isn't a minor line item on the budget. It is one of the biggest costs in the entire operation. When diesel goes up, hauling timber becomes less profitable almost immediately, and there is very little a small independent operator can do to absorb that kind of hit. Meanwhile, the prices timber mills were paying for logs weren't rising to match any of it. Bobby was caught in a trap that hundreds of small independent logging operations across America were caught in during the same period. Costs going up on every side while revenue stayed flat or declined. It is the kind of financial pressure that doesn't announce itself dramatically. It just builds slowly, week after week, until one day the numbers simply don't work anymore. No amount of hard work changes the math. Then came 2020, and everything that was already fragile broke completely. The year that destroyed everything. If the years leading up to 2020 were slow pressure building quietly in the background, then 2020 itself was the moment everything collapsed at once, and there was nothing Bobby Goodson or anyone like him could do to stop it. The COVID-19 pandemic didn't just slow the logging industry down, it systematically dismantled it from multiple directions simultaneously, and small independent operations like Bobby's were the least equipped to survive that kind of assault. Timber mills began shutting down or dramatically reducing operations almost immediately, and when the mills stop running, the entire chain that feeds them stops too. There was nowhere to deliver the logs, no point in cutting them, and no revenue coming in to cover the costs that kept arriving regardless. Overnight, the business that Bobby had spent decades building went from struggling to completely stalled. The supply chain disruptions made everything worse. Equipment parts that were already hard to source in normal times became nearly impossible to get. Machines that needed repairs sat idle for weeks, waiting on components that were stuck somewhere in a broken logistics system. And every idle day was another day of zero production with full overhead still running. Then fuel prices swung wildly during the same period, making the hauling side of the operation unpredictable and, at certain points, genuinely unprofitable. Bobby had survived tight margins before. He had survived equipment failures and slow markets and industry consolidation, because those were problems that arrived one at a time and could be managed one at a time. But 2020 didn't send problems one at a time. It sent all of them together, simultaneously, with no warning and no mercy. And for the first time in decades, there was genuinely no clear way forward. For a man who had always found a way through, running out of road was something entirely new. The live stream that shocked everyone. Bobby Goodson was never the kind of man who complained publicly. He never chased sympathy, never played the victim, and never used social media to air his frustrations the way so many people do. So when he went live on Facebook in 2022 to speak directly to his followers, people paid attention immediately, and what he said shocked them. He announced that after decades of operation, his logging business was officially closing, and he wasn't reading from a script or hiding behind a carefully worded statement. He was just talking, plainly and honestly, the same way he had always talked to people throughout his entire life. He explained what had happened, the rising costs, the market shifts, the toll that years of financial pressure had taken, and the way that 2020 had ultimately broken something that had already been under enormous strain for a very long time. There was no anger in the way he spoke, and there was no bitterness either. Just a quiet and dignified honesty that was somehow more powerful than any dramatic breakdown could ever have been. People watching that live stream weren't just seeing Bobby Goodson close a business, they were seeing something much bigger than that. They were seeing the face of an entire industry that had been quietly struggling for years while the rest of the world looked the other way. Independent operators, small family businesses, people who built something real with their hands and then watched the market slowly make it impossible to survive. Bobby spoke for all of them that day, without even trying to. The comments flooded in from loggers, from fans, from small business owners across completely different industries who recognized exactly what he was describing. Because this wasn't a man quitting, this was a man who had simply run out of road and was honest enough to say that this was the end. The ending nobody expected. Most stories like Bobby Goodson's don't end well, and when they do end, they rarely end with dignity intact, because the pressure that comes with financial collapse has a way of changing people, making them bitter, making them desperate, making them chase whatever second act might bring back some version of what they lost. Bobby didn't do any of that. After the business closed, he didn't rebrand himself as a motivational speaker. He didn't launch a comeback show. He didn't manufacture drama to stay relevant in a world that rewards noise over substance. He simply remained exactly who he had always been, a straightforward, honest, hard-working man who had built something real and was at peace with the life he had lived. He kept engaging with fans who reached out, answering questions honestly, never pretending the ending was something other than what it was, and never dressing up the pain of closing a business he had poured decades of his life into. That kind of integrity is rarer than most people realize. Bobby had built something real in one of the hardest industries imaginable. He fought longer than most people would have, and when the road finally ended, he walked away with his head up and his integrity completely untouched. Not many people get an ending like that, but Bobby Goodson did, and that is exactly why his story is still worth telling. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.